Alrighty, hello everybody. I'm pleased to welcome you to the second season of our podcast series, now equipped with video, which is awesome. It's nice able to see us. So my name is Faolan Smith. I'm a music education major and a music enthusiast at CNF Austin State University, and I'm joined by my co-host.
Hey, I'm Chris Kaatz. I'm the Assistant Director of Bands at Stephen F. Austin State University, and I've been working with Faolan for the last several semesters on this podcast. It's been a fun little journey, so we're excited to dive in.
Yes. So today is a little different, because I know normally we do a big wind band piece. This time I'm doing something for a project for my classes. So I'm in music history 2 currently right now, and we have to do a paper where we analyze 6 pieces on a certain theme. And I decided to do an extra thing where I do a podcast and I analyze a 7th piece that's not related to the paper, but it still relates to the theme. The theme I chose was tragedy, and the piece we are talking about today has to deal with a major bombing incident that happened during World War II, where the city of Dresden was bombed by Allied forces in 1945, and a lot of people died as a result of that. And throughout this podcast, we'll be talking about how this piece depicts the tragedy in the music and certain effects that were happening to allow for that to happen. So it's going to be a really interesting podcast. It's a little bit different from what we're normally used to, but it should be just as informative. So let's dive into this piece. So the piece we're going to be talking about is Symphony no. 1 by Daniel Bukvich. He's currently an American composer. He was born in 1954 in Butte, Montana. His last name is pronounced Bukvich, so people may see that and be like, how do you pronounce that last name? It's Bukvich, so Bukvich, like the deer-headed bitch. So then he's a percussionist. He played percussion for most of his life. And he actually went to Montana State University. He got his bachelor's degree there. And he got his master's degree at the University of Ohio. And he started teaching there in 1978. He teaches music theory and jazz theory, oral skills. He even directs the jazz ensemble. He also plays in the faculty jazz ensemble, so he's still being able to play as a musician, which is really cool. He actually composes various pieces for the groups there, the large ensembles and their small ensembles. And he actually still works there to this day. He still works at the University of Ohio, and he still composes pieces there. University of Idaho, and he still composes pieces there today, which is really cool. So his compositional output, he has a relatively decent sized output, but his pieces, a lot of them aren't very known. He has 2 symphonies, and the Symphony no. 1 in Memoriam-Dresden 1945 is the work on our list today. He has various chamber works and multiple concerti and multiple works for winds. So the composition overview. So it's written in 1978, so right as he was about to graduate with his master's degree. And it was originally, it's a 4-movement piece, and the 4th movement was composed first. It was originally a graduate recital piece with no title. And the original piece was less instrumentation than what we have today. Just low brass and percussion were eventually added on further. So basically it was just woodwinds and high brass. That was literally it. And the original piece has a vocal solo at the end. There's a little bit interesting difference in the piece we're going to talk about today, this wind ensemble adaptation of that. So we'll get there when we get to the end of the 4th movement. And the title and program were eventually added on after an audience member thought the music reminded them of the bombing of Dresden in 1945. So we'll talk more about how the music's conveying effects of the bombing as we go on throughout this podcast. So other movements were added on eventually to create Symphony no. 1, and this is actually written for Robert Spevacek, the DOB at Idaho. And this is premiered in 1978 at the MEC, now NAFME, National Conference Music Educators, in Chicago by the wind ensemble at that university. And this work's subtitle and movement titles were added by a publisher. It was taken from the book The Destruction of Dresden by David Irving. So, Dr. K, so we're going to read the program note for this. This is a very programmatic piece that depicts the bombing of World War II. So the program note says, on the night of February 13th, 1945, Allied forces firebombed the undefended German city of Dresden. Swollen by the flow of refugees, the advancing Russian army, and almost twice its normal population, the quote-unquote firestorm killed approximately 150,000 men, women, and children. The program note ends there. So, piece in 4 brief movements. The movements are not super long. The piece's combined length is about 7 minutes, so it's not a super crazy long piece. And the first 3 movements serve as a build-up to the firestorm, which is movement 4, which is the actual bombing. We'll talk more about how this movement's depicting the bombing as we get further on, as I mentioned previously. And the movements are playatotica, which means there is no break in between. So, especially you see symphonies, people go watch the symphony and they see, okay, there's a break between that movement. This is not going to be the case. Everything is played without pause. So I'm going to turn everything over to Dr. Kaatz. He's going to talk more details about what this piece is.
Yeah, just to give a little bit of context about the event that this piece is representing. So February 13, 1945, for those of you who are not super strong history buffs, that was 9 months after the famous D-Day landing, where the Allies came into the south of France to start to push towards Germany. It was 2 months after the Battle of the Bulge, which was one of the pivotal battles that kind of shifted power for the Allies in the World War II conflict, and it was 3 months before Germany's surrender. So this event was pretty close to the end of the war, and it was interesting when I did this piece several years ago with the symphonic band here, we talked about that it's interesting that this piece is representing a event, because I think a lot of times in World War II we think about, the Allies were the good guys and only did good things, and the Axis powers were the bad guys and only did bad things, but war is an atrocity and there's terrible things that happen on both sides. So it's interesting that an American composer, Daniel Bukvich, chose to write this piece about an event that was caused by the Allies, where a lot of civilians were killed that were in a city that was controlled by the Axis powers. And just to recall from the program note, the population size of Dresden kind of almost doubled because of the number of refugees that were fleeing from Russia. So really, this is a representation of, to get to Faolan's theme of tragedy, this is a really tragic event because most of the people that were negatively affected by this and killed and lost their lives or lost loved ones were innocent bystanders that were civilians in the conflict. So it just kind of underlines how terrible World War II was. So that's just something to keep in mind, is the context of this event in World War II, because I think that that sort of changes some of the interpretation of the piece. In regards to some just mechanical things with this piece, it does use slightly larger forces than one would expect for a grade 4 wind ensemble piece. So a typical one-on-a-part grade 4 wind ensemble work is probably going to have a minimum of 32 players required to play the composition. So you're probably going to have a piccolo and 2 flutes, a couple of oboes, a couple bassoons, 3 clarinet parts, a bass clarinet, 4 saxes, 2 altos, tenor, bari, 3 trumpet parts, 4 horn parts, and then probably 2 or 3 trombone parts, a euphonium part, a tuba part, and then around 5 percussion. Symphony no. 1, it needs a minimum of 44 players to perform it, and some not necessarily oddities, but some uncommon instrumentation choices that Bukvich employs here are there are 6 flute parts, 2 people playing piccolo and 4 people playing flute. He has a couple of oboe parts, one of which is an English horn part. And then he has 7 clarinets required for this piece, so 6 B-flat clarinet parts, and then 1 bass clarinet part. Saxes are what you would expect. There's 6 trumpet parts and 4 trombone parts, so a little bit bigger than kind of standard instrumentation for a grade 4 wind ensemble. And then there's 2 euphonium parts and 2 tuba parts. And then there's 5 percussion that you need a minimum of 5 percussionists to perform this piece. Somebody will be playing timpani. Percussion 1 and 2 can be covered by one person, but percussion 3 needs to be split amongst 2 people because there are instruments that overlap at the same time in that part. Which this should be fine for like a standard, wind band instrumentation, a modern day premier wind band instrumentation, which that's a whole podcast in and of itself, or at least one episode, but maybe multiple, would be around 48-ish players. So a lot of top tier ensembles are probably going to have 5 flutists, 2, typically somebody on piccolo, and then 2 on each of the first and second parts. Around 3 oboists, so a first player, second part player, English horn player, 3 bassoons, first, second, contrabassoon. A lot of ensembles will double up their clarinets, so they probably have somebody on E-flat, somebody on bass, maybe an additional person playing like a contrabass clarinet part, and then you're typically going to double up first, second, and third clarinet. So you're looking at 8 or 9 clarinetists. I know a lot of the military bands will have really deep clarinet sections. Like the President's Own, I think they usually have somewhere in the range of like 12 to 20 even playing at any given time. So they employ more than that, but they don't necessarily have all those people playing at once. And then, a typical wind ensemble is usually going to have 6 to 8 trumpet players, 4 plus horn players, around 3 or 4 trombones, a couple of euphoniums, a couple of tubas, and then at least 5 percussionists. And then a lot of like upper tier ensembles are going to have 3 string players with them. So a string bass player, a harp player, and a piano player. Because a lot of grade 6, grade 5 repertoire even now is calling for one or all of at least one of those 3 string instruments.
And I probably should mention, a particular composer who uses this relatively frequently is Donald Grantham. He has a pretty good piece called Starry Crown that uses all 3 of them. Same with another piece called Jayat El Bal. So if you want to see an ensemble using that instrumentation, definitely check out Donald Grantham's music. He has some really cool stuff. So anyways, back to it.
Yeah, Grantham's got a lot of great stuff. We've played quite a bit of that here. The Wind Symphony, our second ensemble, our second concert band, is actually working on Southern Harmony by him. So one of his most well-known pieces for the wind ensemble that's kind of made itself into a core repertoire piece for the group. So another interesting thing about this piece, I think the instrumentation thing, that's worth noting. So that's one of those nitty-gritty logistical conductor things that you just need to be aware of if you're doing this piece. But from a programming standpoint and a teaching, rehearsing standpoint, you're really going to want to be aware of the fact that this uses a lot of novel effects. So on the instrument side, there's going to be glissandi in instruments other than trombone, so that's not particularly typical, so some pitch bending that happens in several of the instruments. There's going to be kind of these abrupt jazz-style releases that are going to happen that have to be precisely in time, that are not necessarily super resonant like we typically strive for with a wind band. And there's a lot of effects where players are blowing air through the instrument to create sort of a wind effect, but are not going to be producing any specific pitch. There are these vocalizations, so there's screaming, there's humming, there's whistling, there's spoken German words we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the 4th movement, but kind of representing citizens of the city of Dresden. And then there's a special percussion instrument that you have to build that Bukvich calls a gong drum. It does not involve a gong whatsoever. It's what you do is you take a bass drum. So the exact instructions from the score are gong drums. You use these in the 4th movement exclusively. 2 one-headed bass drums hanging vertically from a rack used in 4th movement only. So you take these drums and you kind of hang them up and you have to rig them. It's not that difficult to create. The rigging is probably the hardest part, but it creates this kind of special effect that he uses in the last movement.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that effect once we get to the 4th movement of this piece. So.
Yep. Great. So I think now we're going to kind of dive into some of the analysis. So as Faolan said, all of these movements are attacca, meaning that they're going to be performed back to back to back to back to back. So the listener may not identify that we're in a new movement right away, although the starts of each movement are kind of clear. The first movement is pretty quiet. The second movement is fast and loud. The third movement is pretty quiet. And then the 4th movement is the firebomb, or the firestorm, and we'll talk about that when we get there. So that's just, it's worth writing that if you're going to provide your audience with program notes or speak with your audience about the piece. This is a piece that I find it's beneficial to talk to the audience about what it represents, because not everybody reads the program notes. Because if you just play this, by the end, when everybody's screaming on stage, if folks aren't aware that that's going to happen, they may get a little worried and think that something bad is happening, but that's part of the piece. So I think this is a piece that definitely merits a little bit of introduction to the audience. I'll also say that when I did this piece a few years ago, and I'm planning to do it again this spring semester, there was a really positive audience reaction. They thought it was like really compelling. It's not the most cheerful piece in the world, but it does elicit a pretty strong reaction from the audience. And this piece, similar to Old Churches by Michael Colgrass, is not hard, I don't think. I don't think there's anything in here that's technically very difficult, but it is tricky and there are a lot of novel effects. And so I think it does take an ensemble a while to warm up to it and kind of understand what they need to do. But it's a great piece and it's a very accessible piece for a lot of ensembles, assuming you have the instrumentation to fill it out.
Yeah. And I probably should mention, considering the fact we actually played Old Churches last year, and I was the only euphonium player on that piece, so I had a bigger challenge for me. But I really enjoyed playing it. It was a piece that I think any director should definitely consider doing, especially with an advanced middle school band. It's not super hard, like you said. It's relatively simple. It's a grade 2 on the PML, so that means I think most probably the advanced middle school bands should be able to approach Old Churches, but that's a great piece to check out. A lot of Gregorian chant elements present in it.
Yeah, I think there are not a lot of those pieces that are really high quality that sound more mature than they are in kind of the lower grade levels of our repertoire. But this piece is absolutely one of them. Old Churches is absolutely one of them. And I think this piece is less well known than Old Churches and probably deserves a lot more play than it has gotten in the last several years. So, all right, well, let's jump into the analysis. Because this is a very highly programmatic piece, meaning that it is drawing pretty explicit connections to the idea of the firebombing of Dresden, each movement is sort of representing something specifically about the city and or specifically about the event of the firebombing. Faolan's gonna read the program note for each movement because Bukvich gives sort of this is exactly what this movement is about, so you don't have to guess. He just tells you, and then you can kind of use the tools and the materials that he's given you inside of the movement to help create that effect, whatever that is.
All right, so the first movement is entitled Prologue. That's what it's called, nothing else. And this movement's very, very brief in terms of time. It's only about a minute and a half at tempo. As you mentioned previously, this work is pretty brief. It's only about 7 minutes combined for all 4 movements. And the program note goes as, this movement establishes the mood of impending doom, disaster, and presence. That's the thematic material upon which the rest of the piece is based. So basically, it's getting the main themes and melodies the rest of the piece is going to base itself off of, is essentially what the program note is saying.
Yeah, so this movement is constructed with pretty slow tempo, and the rhythmic construction creates this kind of metric ambiguity. So this movement really sort of feels like it's amorphous. There's not really any sense of time or tempo. You're just sort of waiting in like this dark atmosphere, and there's these themes and these little fragments of music and sound happening. And I think that's pretty intentional by Bukvich, is that it's not supposed to feel particularly rhythmic, unlike the second movement, which is hyper-rhythmic. So part of what is going on in this piece, there are some recurring motives that pop up that we see not only in this particular movement, but we see in the whole piece. So the first event that happens here is there's a low bass drum that kind of sets this ominous rumble in the distance, and then you get this bell motive that forms a C flat 2 chord. So it's essentially a C major triad, but with a D flat inserted in between the C and the E. And I would say that it's not a flat 9 because it's nestled right in the chord. So for the theory nerds out there, you can push your glasses up on your nose and be like, oh yes, it's actually an added flat 2, and it's not really an added flat 9. But that's sort of what that is. And we get this bell motive 6 times, and for me, this kind of demarcates the beginning of each sort of phrase that happens in the piece. And so that C flat 2 chord happens quite a bit throughout this piece, and so it's kind of, we get it sort of in its fragmented form in this movement, and then it becomes more fleshed out in a regularly occurring harmony throughout the rest of the movement. When you get over to measure 6, we hear this fragment of Ave Maria, which is played in its entirety in Movement 3. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But this Ave Maria theme is used throughout the entire piece. And so this is, I guess you could say, kind of representative of the people of Dresden and of the city itself. It's kind of Ave Maria. It has religious overtones to it, obviously. And this particular theme is modeled not after the probably more commonly known version that's by Schubert, but this is modeled after the arrangement by Gounod, Charles Gounod, French composer. And what he did is he took he set a melody to the Ave Maria text, and then he put it over a very slightly modified version of Bach's first prelude from the Well-Tempered Clavier, the C major prelude. So if you go and you listen to this, I think Faolan will possibly put a link to that in the show notes, so you can go and look at that and listen to it. But it sounds just like the opening to the Well-Tempered Clavier.
Yes, I probably should go ahead and mention some stuff that could be used to tie into the theme. So the bell motive, that could be representing the churches in Dresden, because Dresden's a city with a lot of very old buildings. Especially if you look at pictures of Dresden on Google Maps, you can see there's a lot of very old buildings and big squares in there. So that could be the bells could be used to represent the buildings of Dresden and the beautiful churches. And the Ave Maria, that could also be used to represent possibly just the people in general, or the religious text part life in Dresden, because a lot of these buildings were churches, and there are a lot of people there who use German life and the religion essentially big in Dresden. So that's definitely a couple things that could be happening. And same with the Gunon Bach, the Ave Maria theme, because J.S. Bach was German. He did write a lot of pieces in Germany. So it's possible that could be used in drawing back on a big musical figure, J.S. Bach, who lived in Germany. So that's a definitely thing to definitely consider.
Yeah, that's a great observation, Faolan. Yeah, if any of you have ever gone over to Europe, it was mind-boggling for me the first time I was there. I was like, this pub is older than the country in which I live, and that's very normal in Europe. So when he says a lot of old buildings, yeah, that's Europe is very interesting in that regard. That there's a lot of history that you can just physically see because the buildings are centuries, sometimes millennia old, which is fascinating. A little note about this motive, the bell motive, that's kind of interesting. The first iteration, you have this dong ding that happens, and then Bukvich will gradually rhythmically augment the amount of space between the lower two pitches and the upper two pitches, because you have a D flat and an E, and then it goes up to a C and a G. But then when you get to the fifth iteration, which happens after this big gnarly chord that we're going to talk about in a minute, in 18, he does what's called a retrograde, so he inverts it. So he does the higher motive and then it descends. And then that is more rhythmically close together, the dong ding, and then the very last one, there's no rest in between the upper two notes and the lower two notes. So that's just an important little detail for conductors to zero in on. Rehearsal letter A, 13, the Ave Maria fragment has a little bit of a chromatic affectation to it, and then it gets much bolder, and we get this kind of deep chord in the brass. And then right at measure 17, we get this huge bombastic tutti chord. That's the first time that the whole band has played. And if you go in and do the analysis, you will find that all 12 pitches in the chromatic scale are used in that chord. And for the most part, they're clustered pretty tight together, so they're all right on top of each other. So it's really, really crunchy, and to me, I don't think it's supposed to sound like any specific chord. It's just supposed to sound like a sound mass, and that's maybe representing terror and fear and kind of forecasting what's going to happen in movement 4. So after that crazy thing happens, we get this penultimate version of the penultimate statement of the bell motive, and then we have like kind of this low sustain, and then there's one more iteration of the bell motive, and then we go into movement 2.
Yes, and some other things that could be happening to depict the tragedy, especially in measure 13, when it immediately grows aggressive, could see people seeing the Allied planes flying in, and they're seeing them, and they're not sure what to do, and the cluster chord with all 12 pitches could mean that the bombs are about to fall and people are starting in shock about what they're seeing and they're not sure how to react. So that could be possibly a couple things he's trying to depict in this movement before, the firestorm at the very end.
Yeah, absolutely. So going on to the second movement, Seeds in the Wind. That's a very odd title, but Faolan's going to read the program note, and that will help explain some of the oddities of the title.
Yes, so Seeds in the Wind, it's 1 minute and 45 seconds long. It's probably the second longest movement in this piece. So according to the program note, it says, the title of this movement refers to the method of seeding the bomb target with jelly, gasoline, or incendiaries. The movement portrays the fury of the bombing attack. So usually people think of things with, the Vietnam War, people were doing napalm bombings, essentially. This is essentially what that is. This is a predecessor to using napalm in the Vietnam War.
Yeah, so they would drop these gasoline, these jellied gasoline things, so they would stick to buildings and stick to surfaces and all this sort of stuff, so that when the bombs were dropped, the gasoline would erupt and then the whole city was just on fire. So it wasn't just, okay, we're going to get the impact of the bomb destroying this one building. It's the bomb's going to go off and then ignite gasoline that's going to burn the city and level it to the ground. So again, this is underlining and highlighting the atrocities of war and just how incredibly destructive and horrific a lot of the weapons that were used on both sides, the Allies and the Axis powers during this conflict. So movement 2, unlike movement 1, this is very fast and very rhythmic. The first movement is set at a tempo of 66 beats per minute, whereas this movement is set at 160 beats per minute, and almost throughout the entirety of the movement, with very few exceptions, there's an underlined 16th note, digga 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 ostinato going. It's somewhere, usually in the percussion section. So we get this ostinato that grows out of the timpani, and then what happens for the rest of the movement, it's a series of loud gestures, and it's not particularly metrical, so there's not really a sense of I'm clearly in this meter and we're hearing lots of themes that are clearly in a specific time signature, but you get a lot of these sort of aggressive gestures like loud chord, and then some more people join, and then there will be like a softer chord with some sort of effect going on in the timpani, some thunderous percussion hits, all of this sort of stuff. Throughout the movement, we do get some various thematic ideas that happen. So at B, we get this da-da-da, which you can kind of equate to the opening of, it's the same interval as the opening of the Ave Maria theme that we heard at the beginning of movement 1. And so B, you get that chromatic idea passed around the ensemble. And this is a prime example in this piece, this movement in particular. This is tricky because the players in the ensemble have to count really carefully. In this piece, especially the first couple of times you go through it, it doesn't necessarily feel like you're playing it correctly because there's not a lot of melodic material to hang on to. A lot of times when you're playing music, even if it's challenging, you're like, oh yeah, okay, that was right. I know that was right the way I played it. But there's a lot of players will second guess themselves a lot on this because it's really, it's just sort of this ambiguous, gestural, not particularly melodic sort of material in the piece. I do want to note that if you look at measures 15, 16, 17, you'll see this notation where Bukvich at the end of these sustained notes has this X note head that's an eighth note. He's asked there's a description of this at the beginning of the score, but he's asked that be a really abrupt release, so da. So not necessarily a tongue release, but a hard breath release is how I would recommend doing that for conductors aspiring to do this piece. So kind of a da. So it's almost like a jazz articulation. We would use that more frequently in jazz than we would in classical. Typically in classical articulations. And then there's some 3/8 bars thrown in here just to add some little rhythmic variation. And a lot of the articulation material in here, I think that creates a lot of the flavor of the piece because it's pretty aggressive, pretty harsh articulations that you're getting in a lot of this stuff. We get this really interesting effect at C where the flutes are blowing through their instrument and wiggling their keys, so it's just supposed to sound like this flurry of activity that's happening. And then also in the second bar of C, measure 37, we get this kind of fuzzy notation is what it looks like. It's all these dashed lines. And what the players are supposed to do there, according to the program note at the front of the score, says repeat one or all of the following German words as rapidly as possible without changing the pitch of the voice in monotone. Hilfe, Führer, Rauch, Viertaufe, Führen, Sturm. So those are all German words that mean various things. We'll talk about that when we get to the last movement. But there are things like firestorm, fire, danger, like that sort of stuff. And that's, I think, I'll let Faolan kind of give his 2 cents on that, but, that's sort of representing citizens and that sort of thing. A couple of other highlights in this movement. This is more sort of a practical rehearsal standpoint thing. I will tell you from experience that this movement is tricky because people struggle to count correctly. B in particular, you really got to go through that and make sure that all of the entrances of that little chromatic motive are passed around and entering correctly and that people have a good understanding of that. When I did this piece and when I plan to do this piece again, we'll have the students just write in, okay, this is the instrument that happens here. This is the instrument that happens here. And then I think probably the trickiest bit in this piece is at letter D. You have this hocketed trumpet thing, so meaning that there's a rhythm that is picked up exactly by different parts of the trumpet. So you have 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2, 4 and 1 and 2, and so that kind of thing, and it's being passed around really rapidly. And this is not hard by any stretch of the imagination, but this is something that you really got to get it slow, and the trumpets really have to have an understanding of how their patterns interrelate with one another. So that's a spot I would definitely zero in on early in the rehearsal cycle. And then once you get to 62, there's this really great effect. Straight mute trumpets on a sustaining that C flat 2 chord that we talked about earlier, and then there are these big rhythmic sforzando marcato hits, these da. But the rhythm there is a little tricky because there's some syncopation, and there's not really a lot of other meter to hang your hat on other than the snare drum providing 16th notes in the background. So that's something to look at. And then at 67, second bar of E, we get this really gnarly, awesome Ave Maria quote, this da, da, da idea. And so that's really something to go after and make sure that the students understand, that your ensemble understands that that is supposed to be the Ave Maria quote. And then other than that, this kind of, starting at F, we get more of that flute effect that is played by multiple instruments, and things start to fizzle out from there. There is a piccolo solo in Piccolo 1, because there's multiple piccolos in this piece, at measure 82. That's kind of the last loud statement of anything that we have. And then we get another Ave Maria quote in, 85 by Clarinet 1 by a soloist there, and then that's echoed by a couple other solo instruments at the end. There is, I will have you know, in measure 84 in errata in the third horn, it should be a written A flat, so a written A flat 4. So those of you looking at this, that's something to be aware of.
So some things that could be happening in this movement that could depict the tragedy. For example, the opening aggressive nature could represent the actual falling of the seeding. Usually the seeding happens before the bombs are actually dropped. So that could represent the placement of the seeds, and the German words represent people seeing the seeds and like, oh man, there's seeds here. They're about to bomb the city. What could happen when the bombs drop? And another thing that could be used to represent, especially with the piccolo, that could represent like a woman or a child starting to scream after seeing the seeding happening. And after that, the seeding happens, then the horn and everything else feeds into the Ave Maria statement, which is aggressive. Could represent people just all angry. Their beautiful city, full of all this rich history and culture, is about to be destroyed in this firebombing.
Yeah. All right, so moving on to the third movement. This is another slow movement. We're going to have Faolan read the program note to kind of give some preface for this, then we'll chat through it.
Yep, so this movement is entitled Ave Maria, as we mentioned with the Ave Maria theme previously. It's the longest movement out of this piece. It's 2 minutes long. And the program note goes as, the material in this movement reflects upon the religious and artistic heritage of Dresden and becomes a prayer for the victims of the attack. So, as you both mentioned about Dresden being a big cultural hub in Germany with a lot of older buildings, this is definitely a good reflection as to how that's happening in the city.
Yeah. And so this is a pretty quiet, somber, sort of slow movement. It's interesting to note that this movement and movement 1 have the same tempo of 66 beats per minute. And I think that's pretty intentional by Bukvich, because the Ave Maria fragments that we hear in movement 1 should remind us very strongly. We should be recollecting that when we get here to the third movement, and movement 1 is kind of forecasting to this movement. So the interrelated tempi, I think, help make sure that that is going to be really explicit to the listener in the audience. So you want to make sure that you balance the tempos, that they're same or pretty darn close when you're doing this piece. And so we kind of open with a muted trumpet, and then we go to horn, which are the 2 instruments that introduce the Ave Maria theme at the beginning of the piece. Although it's inverted, it's horn and then muted trumpet responds. But then most of this movement is just passing around material of the theme. And in my opinion, you probably want that to be as seamless or dovetailed, handing off as best as possible. And this movement is, I think, the only one that has like a really clear form. It's in strophic form, which is just a flavor of theme and variations, which we've talked about a lot on this podcast, because that is a common favorite theme in the wind band repertoire. But this, there's 3 strophes of the piece. The first strophe is at measure 1. You get sort of an introductory measure, and then the theme is, for the theory nerds out there, what I would call a sentence. You get a 3-measure kind of basic idea, da, 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 and then a repetition of the basic idea, so pretty similar material, da, 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 and then you get a continuation, which is going to be an elaboration of that material, and then that's passed by several instruments. The second strophe occurs the bar before G, so the English horn will start the solo here. So that's really important to note. If you have access to an English horn and you have, both instrument and a player who can be adept at playing it, it's really worth doing it. But it's cued in alto saxophone in the event that you do not have that. So English horn starts the solo at G and then carries that for quite a while. So this one is a little bit different because this statement is entirely in the English horn, unlike the previous strophe where it's interspersed between multiple instruments. And then the final strophe happens at letter H. The end of the third strophe, it's worth noting, there are these little aggressive gestures that happen in clarinet and some of the brass. So those are important to bring out because it's kind of like getting at some of this twinge of like the first statement is relatively calm and lovely, but then the second the second statement right at the end gets a little and there's a little bit of aggressive stuff happening there to kind of remind us that the tragedy is occurring. And then the bar before H, measure 22, that's the beginning of the third strophe. This is the most rhythmically active strophe. There's a fair amount of accompaniment that is happening here, which the accompaniment is pretty sparse prior to that. And then at the very end of this movement, we get a G add flat 2. So the same harmony that we've been encountering throughout the piece, except now G is the root instead of C. So you get this kind of demented version of a half cadence here if the piece is in C, because now you're on this like G with this added flat 2 in it. This really loud, lowly voiced G flat 2 chord in the low brass that sets up the firebombing, which is the fourth movement.
Yes. So some things that Bukvich could be doing in this movement to help emulate this is, I think this movement personally is supposed to represent a chorus in a church. And they're at a church singing this chorale, right, the Ave Maria melody right before the bombing happens. Now, they're not aware of the bombing. They're just in there singing it and being aware of the beauty of their city. And eventually, even the second strophe comes around. I think it's just one or two singers singing it. And as it gets more rhythmically active, I think they're catching on, noticing something bad's about to happen. In this case, the seeding about to happen in the city, then the actual bombing. And then I think also this helps to add on at the very end where it's all rhythmically aggressive with those cluster chords and the G flat 2 chord. I think it's the chorus growing more upset and agitated as their city is about to be destroyed. And they're trying to maintain their composure as they're singing the melody to end the movement. So let's go on to the movement where this all began, the firestorm.
Yeah, so Faolan's going to read the program note for this. One real quick thing on the third movement, just from a practical standpoint, I would suggest probably rehearsing the soloist separately if you have the capacity to, break out your rehearsal that way. And really the only portion of the third movement that needs to be rehearsed with the whole group at once, regularly at least, you're going to need to give them reps so they understand the whole movement, but is the third strophe. And like Faolan was saying, it sounds like a chorale, people in church. That there very much is kind of a chorale style setting of the third strophe. So the harmony, I think, is most important in the entire piece in that particular strophe of that movement, because it's the only spot where the harmony is pretty functional. The rest of the time you're getting, a lot of different versions of that add flat 2 chord. You're getting some quintal and quartal harmony and a lot of cluster chords. So the harmony is more of an effect than it is functional, but in that third strophe you do get some functional harmony, which is important to be aware of. So Faolan, take it away. Give us the program note for the fourth movement.
All right, this is the movement everything's building up to. This is called the firestorm. In this movement, there's a lot of scoring differences compared to the original. Dr. Kaatz can go in detail about that once I finish reading the program note. So this movement is called the firestorm. It's 90 seconds long, almost exactly. The program note is, in this movement, the sounds of the quote-unquote firestorm are recreated. Musically, the last movement serves as a resolution to the tension buildup in the previous three movements.
Yeah, so this movement is written in graphic notation, so I'm going to try to hold this up and see if the camera will see it. But this is, if I can kind of get it straight there, you'll see that there's no real, other than dynamics maybe and rhythm values, there's no real traditional notation here. So starting on this, I'm inverting here, this side of the page, we sort of grow. And if you look right here, right there, it's a little hard to see on the camera, but this is actually, it's like a little slit of a painting that is a picture of the city on fire. So it's pretty explicit in what it's trying to determine. And then this swirling sort of stuff over here is depicting kind of this pitch lowering down and everything kind of coming down and dissipating afterwards. So there's a bunch of really cool effects that happen in this piece. or in this particular movement. So you have this, you have a few different groups. You have this low kind of hum that's happening. So some people are humming as low as possible, starting at piano. And then there's this staggered breathing low G flat 2, G major flat 2 chord that's being played in the low brass. And then timpani is rolling, and then you have a tom-tom rolling. So just kind of a low rumble, and Faolan can kind of share his ideas with what he thinks that is at the end. So that's sort of one group, and that group is steadily getting louder. So they kind of do a giant hairpin for this whole movement, and they're just, that's why the stagger breathing notation is indicated there for the trombones, or for the low brass. It's important to know that the people that are playing that low chord, those are the same people that end the third movement. So that makes the attacca really easy. That's loud, and then conductors, you're probably going to have to just cue that downbeat when you come in. So the next group comes in after about 10 seconds of that low hum going on and that sort of rumble. And you get this effect, which, Bukvich, this is probably the trickiest one. This in the German language is probably the trickiest one to do in this piece. So these are the instructions for the next effect that Bukvich gives us at the beginning of the score. Whistle, starting at a low pitch and gradually getting higher. So then, with the mouth in an O shape, O, and sounding the sh sound, lightly tap the lips with the palm of one hand as fast as possible, but gradually getting slower. So it sounds something like this. So, and you have the whole ensemble doing that. And the trick is this is an aleatoric effect. So people should not be doing this in time with each other. It should be just an effect that's happening all over the place, and people are going at different rates than the other. When I've done aleatoric effects with my ensemble in the past, I just tell them, you have to take a different timing, either a little faster, a little slower, or start a little later or a little earlier than the person next to you. And it's fine if people have sort of a pause. The idea is you just want a constant layering of this effect going on. Yeah.
Going back to what we were saying, we were talking about Michael Kohlgrass's old churches earlier. There's a ton of aleatory effects in that piece. Mm-hmm. So that's definitely a good little analogy of this, especially when you want to do old churches. That's definitely a good piece to draw some ideas on handle aleatory effects from.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so that's the second big event that happens. And then the third event, these gong drums that we talked about earlier, this sort of suspended rigged bass drum is going to start playing, and that is not really going to have a lot of resonance, but then you have a real bass drum that is going to be playing, and that's going to have some resonance. So you're going to kind of get these thud sounds, and then you're going to get boom from the bass drums. So the gong drum, and I think this works great if you have these drums kind of antiphonal, so spread across the stage, so you're kind of hearing these thuds and these sounds from different directions. So that starts at about 20 seconds in. That's the third major event. The fourth major event is you get these, he explicitly says staggered entrances, and you get these whispers that, so he has right here, it's pretty, it's sort of this notation here where it's this filled in kind of crescendo. So you start at a whisper and then move to a mumble and then move to normal speech and then shouts and then screams is what he has in the score. And what you're doing there is the players, the performers, are going to pick one or a multitude of several German words. And so there's I will put I have a resource that I use with my students when I do this that I can maybe have Faolan link somewhere in the comments of the video. But what I do is I can kind of show you the resource here. It's I don't know if the camera's going to pick that up. We can try holding that closer. But it's basically a table it gives you the German word, the English translation of the German word, and then it'll give you a hyperlink to Forvo, which is a really cool website where you can hear people pronounce different words. And it is a Forvo link to German people pronouncing all of these words. So you can hear what it sounds like when a German says this German word. And so the words are Hilfe, which means help, Feuer, which means fire, Rauch, which means smoke, Feiertafel, which is baptism of fire, and then Feuersturm, which means firestorm. So excuse my German pronunciation. I should have practiced that a little bit more before we got on here. But there's a phonetic spelling over there with the link to the Forvo pronunciation. But so those will come in, and that kind of gets layered into the ensemble, and that's the fourth big event that happens, and that will be a steady build until we get to kind of the big moment where it has the picture of the city burning.
Yes. So some things in the score that he could be doing to represent the tragedy, as I mentioned, is these low notes in the timpani. That could represent the plane's engine, the planes flying underneath. Because usually bombing is not just one plane, it's usually dozens of planes bombing these cities. That could represent the plane, and the staggered inches could represent the planes starting further away and getting closer to the city. Eventually the seeds start falling and the bombing actually commences. The shushing with the... that could represent, I think that represents either one or two things, or possibly both. I think it represents simply the falling of the bombs or an air raid siren. Because especially cities like this, it was very common to have air raid sirens, especially during the war. And it's possible it could represent both the air raid siren and the falling of the bombs. And I also should mention, this movement is very slow. There's no time signature. It's all just staggered seconds and entrances in the scores, as Dr. Kaatz showed you the picture earlier. And at 30 seconds, the whispers come in and the percussion comes in at 20. I think the percussion represents the bombs hitting the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
And the whispers represent people seeing the bombs, and at first they're not sure what to do when they see them. As they get louder, they're seeing more of the intensity of the situation with the bombs hitting the city and it being destroyed, and everyone's yelling and screaming, seeing their city burn. They're not sure what to do, and eventually they get more agitated as it goes along. And eventually ends with a picture at the city where all the bombs have fell and all the fires at its maximum. The bombing itself's over, but the effects are still there. I think this entire movement is supposed to represent the bombing itself and people seeing the city on fire and upset and screaming. Their cultural reference we mentioned in previous movements, it's all gone in the course of probably a couple hours, because these bombings usually happen very quickly. So within a few hours, their entire city was destroyed or at least reduced to rubble, which happened over the course of a few hours, and everything leads to their anger, their frustration, seeing everything they built, everything they love, all gone.
Yeah, and so what I would suggest to really make this movement is going to probably require the most amount of rehearsal just to get the effect right. When you get to the picture, so the peak of the firebomb, he has it along the top of the score. What Bukvich has is he has time in seconds. Now, that doesn't need to be precise. There was an ensemble that was doing a well-known piece one time in rehearsal. It was like showing, this event happens for this number of seconds. And the conductor was literally going at 60 beats per minute conducting it. I do not think that's the spirit of how this should be done. I think the seconds are an approximation. Now, what I have done in the past is I'll put a timer up on the projector and I'll be like, okay, go ahead and perform the piece, and then I'm going to do the timer and you just follow it along. That's probably a really good thing to do a couple of times early on so you get the pacing. So do that individually for yourself as a conductor, but then also have the players do that with you so that they kind of understand the pacing and the movement. But then once you're in the performance, you got to kind of feel it out after you've practiced it enough. I have found that cueing wise, you there's a few different ways you can do this. You can give a number and an event. So like this might be the start of the movement. This might be the bomb, the effect. This could be the dong, dong, dong in the bass drums and the gong drum. This could be the vocalizations. You kind of get the idea. Or you can just point to the different groups, because it's specific groups of instruments will be doing each effect, and that's laid out on the left side of the score. But he does kind of at the top, the little slit of the portrait of Dresden being firebombed goes from 60 seconds to 65 seconds. So I think he does want that peak to last a moment. He wants it to last five or so seconds. So I've found that once you get there, like people can on stage just really be losing their minds. No, I mean, you don't want to be goofy with it, but like it should be horrific screaming, like I'm in a city that's on fire. And so I think like students, if you get them or you get your ensemble to kind of really reflect on this and do some thoughtful preparation about what this piece is about, they can sell this effect really, really well, but they got to go for it. And then after that happens, there's a big cymbal crash, which is the that's notated in the score. That's the culmination of the whole piece. That's the climax of the whole piece, in my opinion. And then there's more of that blowing air effect, but there's these kind of downward circles, and they all get smaller. And so those are kind of being diminished. And then at the very end, it says solo flute on low C. And there's an indication for the flute to kind of do a dip. And it has in parentheses next to that muffled sobs. So that flute, the D, is supposed to be muffled sobs. And like when, I think it's really effective if you do this, if the conductor and the ensemble can just be as still as possible. Maybe everybody kind of drops their heads, and you can do all sorts of lighting and video stuff with this too. And so just everything sort of gets darker. And then just turn control over the end of the piece to that flute soloist and let them take their time in between each one of those sobs. And then when they're done, they can just kind of bring their instrument down. And I love with pieces like this to see how long we can have the audience remain in silence before they break it because they're uncomfortable because of their applause. This is definitely the kind of piece where you want to, you can leverage that opportunity. And that's the piece. I mean, Faolan, anything else to add about the fourth movement?
Definitely. Especially this last 30 seconds, there is some other things happening. At the gong drums, you see their hits getting less intense. And that big cymbal crash could represent the final bomb hitting the city and exploding. And then these last little crashes represent the final micro explosions left over from the bombs. As it gets quiet, people are seeing their city and they start to reflect. And this flute solo at the end could represent just the survivor reflecting back to the event, the tragic event that happened. Dresden was destroyed, and just wondering, why did this happen? How could this happen? How could this happen to us? What will happen to our city after this? So I think that's my interpretation as to how this movement ends, personally.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really effective piece. I think it's really well written. It's very accessible to a lot of ensembles, and it sounds dramatically more mature than the technical demands required to produce the piece. So I would encourage everybody to consider programming it, and I think it's very easy to build a really effective program around this piece. And I think this piece is, ripe with opportunities to do kind of cross-curricular collaborations. I mean, you could do a video component with this. There's a lot of like lighting, visual effects stuff that you could do if you have that available to you in your performance space. You could even do like a theatrical thing with having some actors do something to maybe represent sort of the events of the piece. You could do a collaboration with dancers. There's a lot of different ideas that you could do that. I think this piece lends itself really well to doing some really cool novel effects, novel concert presentations that you could do.
Yeah. So it took some other pieces that definitely tie into this tragedy theme a little bit. And I should mention 2 of these pieces I am actively using on my paper. So a lot of these pieces are for wind bands. So what's that, Dr. Kaatz? Tell you about these pieces.
Yeah, so Frank Tekeli and American Elegy, when I did this the last time, I actually paired it with American Elegy. We were kind of tying into, I think, coming out of COVID. There was a school shooting out in Oxford, Michigan that had happened right around that time. American Elegy is about tragedy. It was written for the school shooting in Columbine High School. But I think Frank Tekeli really intentionally did not write that piece to be like sad, representing the horrific events of the shooting, but it was more like the hope and the healing that that those people were searching for and looking forward to coming out of that event. And so this, I think, this paired well with that because they were both about tragedy, whereas this was representing the horrific events of the tragedy, and American Elegy is talking about the hope and healing that comes out of the tragedy. So there's kind of a connection there. Postcard and Sanctuary, both pieces by Frank Tekeli that are kind of remembrance pieces and tying in with different things. And so those are, you could kind of draw a loose connection there. And then Vesuvius, a well-known Tekeli piece, is about it's representing kind of the events of the Vesuvius volcanic eruption. So
yes, and I probably should mention Vesuvius is one of the pieces I'm doing for this paper, so I figured it'd be a good tie-in as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a fun piece. That's a great one that you should check out by to Kelly. That one, in addition to being tricky, I would also say has some spots that are just flat out hard. But it's great. It's a really rewarding piece. It has a lot of really cool stuff. Got a great earworm of a melody to it for sure. Some other pieces that we've talked about, or that we kind of cultivated for this list, are James Barnes' Symphony no. 3, which is written about James Barnes' loss of his young daughter, Natalie. And so that has some similar elements in it where there's some movements representing the negative emotions that Barnes felt in that tragedy, but there's also the third movement is sort of an imagining of what his life would have been like had his daughter lived, and so it's really pretty and beautiful, and that kind of ties in with the Ave Maria movement here in this piece. And then there's also Joel Puckett, his shadow cycle, so this chaconne that he uses in Shadow of Sirius, that piece was written in the wake of their family losing a child, and he's used the chaconne in the central movement that I think is really, him kind of grappling with the hard, difficult emotions of that loss. He uses that in several other pieces that I kind of unofficially call his shadow cycle. So those kind of tie into this piece in a similar way. That's a similar type of tragedy as Symphony no. 3. He has a piece called At Perch for Vespers 9 that's about, I believe, his wife's father, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, his wife. It was his grandfather on his wife's side passed away suddenly. Funny
yeah, that's what it was. Yeah,
it was actually written the year before The Shadow of Sirius was written, so it's a pretty unique tie-in, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a fascinating piece as well. I'm a big fan of Joel's music. We just had him out here a few weeks ago, and he's a brilliant composer, really wonderful musician, has a lot of really compelling, cool music. And then Vital Signs by Viet Quang. Viet, I cannot say enough positive things about him. We had him out here several years ago and are hoping to get him back soon. But his Vital Signs, I think, I will unapologetically in public say that I think it is one of the best pieces written for our medium this millennium, in the last 24, almost 25 years. And it's a fascinating piece, and it was kind of written in the wake of his father passing and being in the hospital and all that. And so that's a fantastic piece that I suggest that you go check out. It was a commission from the Navy Band, the premier Navy Band, and Eighth Blackbird, who's they're a powerhouse new music ensemble. And so it's sort of a concerto for a Pierrot ensemble. That's a topic for another time, but this kind of chamber ensemble and concert band, and it's a really fantastic piece, but also tying into tragedy, similar to this.
So, and this piece especially, as you mentioned previously, it's depicting a major historical event, because this bombing in Dresden, it was one of the biggest events that happened in World War II. Especially a graphic notation, that's pretty rare that it happens, especially in a wind band piece like this. It's commonly you find it in chamber pieces or sometimes solo pieces, but in a large ensemble setting, that's pretty rare that happens. So, based on this, we think these are the things that Bukvich is doing to really help convey this theme along. This theme of this bombing, this tragedy that happened. And this piece is very powerful piece. It's very programmatic. I think any directors out there should definitely consider programming this piece. And I think that's a lot of information we give about this piece. So, Dr. Kaatz, are there any parting thoughts you'd like to give about this piece?
Yeah, I mean, I've said it multiple times on the podcast, and you just said it. I cannot say enough good things about this work. I think it's grossly underplayed. I think a lot more people should be playing it. And I think it's a really fantastic opportunity for students to explore the artistry of shaping sound. If I'm going to put let my turtleneck get up a little high on me here. I think it's a really good way to make music in ways that are unusual and not typical of what we do. And I think it's really accessible for a lot of groups. And I would strongly encourage any directors, any conductors listening to this podcast, consider doing at least one work like this every year. I try to make a really conscious decision to do one of these every year, ideally one every semester, because I think this stretches students artistically in a way that a work unlike this will not. Marches are great. I love me a march. I love me a fanfare and a concert opener, slow, pretty lyrical music. Yeah, you gotta, that's, bread and butter, rice and beans, vegetables, healthy vegetables and fruits. If we're going to make the diet analogy there, I think you gotta put some of that in, but this is sort of like, your antioxidants and your fun food, and like, we're going to go try this thing that we don't really eat a lot, but it's got a lot of, superfood benefits or whatever. So I'm getting off on a goofy tangent here, or a goofy analogy. But I think it's a great piece, and I think that this will stretch your students in a way that a lot of our more traditional repertoire will not.
Alrighty, everyone. Appreciate you guys coming out to listen to this podcast. Hope you'll join us again next time. We got something really special planned, our 1-year anniversary. See y'all next time.